Hey y'all, how's it going? I'm Lusen, they, them. Welcome to talking about hiring decisions. Hiring's hard. I guess I'll introduce myself first as people trickle in because it's the least important part. I'm an engineer by training. I went into middle management, started getting involved in hiring. I work at a company right now called Karat. We do technical interviews. We have hundreds of interviewers. We've done almost 40,000 interviews. And that's the sort of the data set that I'm going to use for this talk. And I'm on the R&D side. I used to be much more involved in hiring and training interviewers, and some of those best practices will show up here. But right now I do a bunch of research on new interview formats. So let's dig in. First of all, what are y'all finding difficult about hiring? Or I mean, I assume that's why you're here. Something's up. Anyone? Yeah, go for it.
Lots and lots of competition right now.
Lots of competition?
Elevating compensation rates and stuff. So it's hard to make sure you're competitive without having to skyrocket and inflate your
Gotcha. So maybe you're giving offers, but your offer to acceptance rate is maybe lower than you want.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the back.
Getting hiring managers to think differently.
Okay. Getting hiring managers to think differently and widen their sense of.
Looking at the capability, not necessarily does it do exactly the job as your current job.
Yeah. How do we define what competencies we want to be looking for? What our hiring bar actually means. Cool. Here's some that just sort of, I took a little perusal of our data situation. So some of the things that we found tech companies are having trouble with. One, hiring is very time intensive. On average, high bar companies, for every hire that they make, are spending about 75 hours of senior engineering time. And I know that might sound like a lot, but when you consider, even if you're only using your more experienced engineers for, say, the on-sites, like that alone can take hours, right? Like a dozen hours all told, because you're going to have multiple rounds. I mean, for high bar companies, there might even be multiple days of on-sites. And it's not just the interview time, right? Someone has to do a write-up. There might be a debrief. And so, this is paired with 5 to 1 is the ratio on average of how many, say, on-sites you might have to do before you want to give someone an offer on average, which is quite high, right? That's if you're taking 15 hours of your senior engineering time to do one candidate, and you have to do 5 of them, that's how you get to 75. And the thing about this is that, and for some companies, this is like a bar of Palantir's like, we reject everyone, so that's why it's great to work here, because we're competitive. And I guess, the reverse, obviously, if it was a 1-to-1 ratio, that would be odd for a couple of reasons. First of all, you'd be like, maybe I don't need to do these, although the on-site does have to do, this is on-site to offer, not, offer to accept might be different, and there's some relationship building and getting to know the company that candidates appreciate too, right? But also, what's the right amount of risk to take? Like if everyone that you're bringing to an on-site gets hired, maybe you're not taking enough risk. You've got some false positives, false negatives, some people that maybe could have moved forward. So what's the right risk? And I don't know, like cut in the middle, like 2 to 3 to 1 or something. But the time, that's one of the hard things about hiring is that it takes a lot of time, and pretty much everyone involved, maybe not recruiters, I don't know, but a lot of people involved are trying to accomplish other things. I'd say even recruiters are trying to do other things, right? You guys are smiling, you're recruiters. So we want it to be efficient, but we want it to be high quality. And that's one of the things that's happening right now. It's hard to scale, a high touch, experience. That this is actually more of a sales and relationship building kind of experience, not just an assessment. So I want you guys to guess, what % of candidates enjoy having like an impersonal test or a one-size-fits-all process? 0. I didn't look at the data. I was just like, gonna assume. People put up with it. And one of the things is that it's generally not data-driven because we're not always in situations where we're able to do this a lot. Like we're just not able to develop a lot of data, or it's inconsistent. Those 5 on-sites each of those on-sites might have used different methodologies, different just processes. There's not a lot of consistency, which can make even the data we get hard to draw conclusions from. So at Karat, we've done 40,000 technical interviews. We hire engineers, senior engineers, from the Bay Area and all over the world, and we provide, we develop questions. That's more of what I'm involved in, the science of how do we write good questions, what formats work. We provide this platform so that interviewers, it's almost like if it were actually your job to assess someone, like how would you do it right if you had all of that resources and time? So that's what we're doing. We've done a bunch of interviews, and we're trying to constantly use this information to improve what we're doing. So what have we learned so far? And I guess this workshop's going to be pretty high level. It's going to kind of go through the big picture of what it takes to hire someone. And I actually do some more deeper, specific workshops, like just focusing on interviewer conduct and communication. Like how do you increase how do you remove the false negatives that sometimes happen from candidates getting too stressed out and not showing you their best. We're not going to go super deep on this one, okay? But it'll still be fun. So, the first thing we kind of already talked about, right, is how do you define your hiring competencies, and and then you have to figure out what interviews, not just questions, but like interview formats and the whole pipeline. How are we going to illuminate that? And this is what we're going to spend the most time on in this workshop, just because that's the foundation. And if we get the right answer to the wrong question, it's not going to help us. So this is, kind of what are the right questions, not just technical questions, but metaphorically for this process that we should be doing. We'll touch a little bit then, if we have time, on how, what are some best practices for interview conduct, for measuring candidate performance. That's like the write-up that happens after, well, whether it's a write-up or not, we're going to look at what are maybe some different levels that will be helpful. And lastly, we'll touch on this a little bit. How do we actually make a hiring decision? How do we establish a hiring bar based on all of this information? And what kind of data do we have that we can analyze? This gets very custom and specific, so we'll see what I can go into. And we may run out of time. But I'm always happy to chat about this afterwards, so luce@karat.com. All right. So let's start with defining hiring competencies. Okay, I'm going to just skip straight to the spoilers. I'm going to go through 4 competencies that I think are good. Well, sorry, I'm not going to tell you what the competencies are, right? That's going to depend on the role and what you're looking for. But at least how we can analyze a competency. One is it's relevant, that it matches the work that's going to be done on the job. And this one's hard, right? Because maybe we're looking for proxies. We only have like a 1 hour, we only have so much, like a very small amount of time to work with someone. And it's really confusing to know, like, what is a reasonable proxy and what is a irrelevant thing to be asking. So that's tricky. Balanced. So this is the idea that if a competency, say there's 2 people that have the same level of skill on this thing, are they both able to demonstrate that in this assessment? And it's essentially saying, can the candidate make choices during an interview or during a hiring process that's going to cause an uneven outcome? Like, we want to protect against that because that's just noise. I'm trying to think if there's, I'll think of examples later. I'm going to move forward on this. We have some examples coming up. The other thing that makes a competency good is, and by the way, with balanced, you could kind of look at it as, is your overall process equitable? And question design can have a lot to do with that. The other thing is objective, which we also might think of as consistent, which is to say, are there choices that are happening in your whole interview program or your whole hiring process and decision making that is influencing the outcome that has not related to the candidate, right? Like if you interview the same candidate twice with different interviewers and you get a different result that probably isn't the candidate's fault, like that's weird, right? Like a consistent process should just depend on the candidate because you're trying to assess their skills. So this is basically, are there interviewer choices? Is this bias coming in, or are there other things happening here? Hey, are the interviews that are happening after lunch always like really negative? Those sort of things. That's one you can look at with data also. And then predictive. And I want to spend a little bit more time on what we mean by predictive. That's a hard question. Okay, we have this graph here. X-axis is time, Y-axis is performance. So when we are assessing someone to hire, we're trying to figure out like what we think their competency level is. Here's their performances over here, and we're trying to narrow that in, like trying to get a good idea of that. But there's kind of big error bars. We're going to hire them, and we have some understanding of where they are, and we're going to hope that over, say there's going to be a performance review 6 months later, a year later, whenever, formal or informal, right? But you're hoping that, not only do you understand this person better, like as a manager, so you can help them grow and develop. But that also is kind of accurate, right? The hiring assessment is not too different from any other form of assessment that you're going to be doing in this long-term relationship, right? It's just you don't have a lot of time and you don't know the person that much before. You maybe are also hoping that there's some growth. Like, your hiring bar in a sense might say, we're going to do a 3-month onboarding, and so we're going to hire them to be here, and then we have this whole plan so that they're going to be here by whatever that timeline is that you can work. You basically have a bunch of work that can get done that requires varying increasing amounts of experience and skills and knowledge, right? And there might be a line where you're like, here's our most junior or early career tasks, and you're trying to figure out like how soon can I get someone to be kind of productive wherever that is, and I'm going to grow them. And so what I'm trying to say here is that companies that have work that spreads this continuum can often have more flexibility in hiring. If all of the work that you have requires like a senior engineer to do it, you can't hire someone in and then it's like hard to grow someone all the way there. But if you have a full continuum, you actually might be more flexible. Okay, so what you're trying to avoid, right, is the case where you make a positive assessment of someone and it turns out later that they're not performing even when you do everything that you can to set them up for success, and you figured out how long that runway might be, whether it's 2 weeks or 6 months or 2 years. Whenever you think this isn't, that things aren't working, that would be a false positive. And the reverse that is invisible for most of us, right? Like if you're at one company, you don't often get to see where your candidates are. Like you don't have a time machine to know like if you had hired this person, would they have been successful? And that's expensive because we have to keep spending time and money hiring people. Okay, so false negatives. So the point here is we want to define our competencies based on what performance success looks like. And as a wonderful, from my original question about what's hard about hiring, this idea of there might be different kinds of success. Like we're trying to build teams where people really care about tests and other people really care about design and some people really care about meeting those emergency like client issues and other people want to meet deadlines and all the different things. What does different kinds of success look like? And minus whatever you kind of have to figure out like how quickly do I need someone to be ready. And so one of the worst competencies, by the way, is something that I could teach someone in 4 hours. I don't want my hiring decisions to be based on something that, right? Like I want to have the 2 years. I mean, how long do I want to retain my most senior and productive, not senior, but my most productive engineers? So that's kind of how I like to think about onboarding time. And certainly anything that I can teach someone quickly, that shouldn't be a competency. And when we get to, in terms of like technical software programming, right, where sometimes people are like, well, should I ask about hash maps? Should I ask about this data structure? And it's like, it's complicated because they're saying it's a proxy. Like maybe I'm looking for how much does someone know, but at the same time, if I can teach someone a data structure in a week, is that a good competent, So I don't have that answer for you guys, but what I do want you to do is trying to figure it out yourselves. So this is a workshop, not just a talk. I've been talking a long time. So what I would like everyone to do is find a partner. You can find a trio if you'd like, and just kind of talk. Share what are the competencies that you look for, and what do you consider noise. We're going to do that just for a few minutes, and then move forward. Hey y'all, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me get your attention. Thank you. Hey, it sounds like you guys are having some good conversations. I'm gonna pull you back into this. Does anyone want to share some of their thoughts from this? Good competencies, noise. Yeah, in the back.
We thought about communication as a good. Communication, that seems like a core competency.
Communication, yes. Yes. Tell me, what is stakeholder management?
So, she talked about design, and I talked about just for myself working inside. All right. She talked about design and also just as a designer, right? Just having to working with stakeholders and being able to communicate with them part of the process. I think that's very important. just in that whole process, because if you haven't had that experience, if it's a big project, that's going to kind of backfold on you, right?
Yes. So like so actually trying to assessing communication, and even more specifically like this forms.
Yeah.
Talking with stakeholders, and what does that mean? What is it required?
Exactly.
This kind of leads into what you were telling me earlier.
Oh. You want me to repeat what I said earlier? Okay. We were talking about competencies that are considered noise, and we're currently in the process of hiring an education and training director for our organization. And as part of their interview process, we asked our 2 final candidates to teach us, or we didn't ask them, but someone did. And one did really well, and one didn't do so well. But when we were talking about it, it's not really relevant because they won't be teaching as part of their position. So we basically put them through this process and ourselves through this process, and it didn't really matter when all was said and done.
Yeah. And look, we've all been there before. So 2 things I want to highlight here. One is like weighting matters, like how important, like this was, maybe it was mentioned on the job description, but it turned out that that wasn't the most important part for this process. And you have to know like what, you have a limited time with candidates. What are the most important things, and what's going to be weighted? Hiring a decision, you have all this information. How do you make that decision? Like that algorithm is that's key, and we'll actually get to that. The second thing I like about this is one thing that you can, if this is happening to you, it's good feedback that you need to improve your process. Is that if people are coming to a debrief and it's starting to go into it's starting to reflect on the process itself. Oh, was this the right question to ask? What is the role? Are we hiring junior or senior? Like if you're getting those kinds of questions in the debrief, people are confused. You basically want to figure out your competencies before you even have an interviewer, a candidate come through. So, but we've all been to those confusing debriefs, and then often we're like, oh, we need to have a kickoff before we start hiring, get everyone on the same page or whatever. Okay, let's keep moving forward. Okay, I want to talk about interview questions, formats, this sort of thing. I'm very excited about this. My current research projects are deep in this realm, so it's a thing that I'm really interested in. We're going to get to some graphs. I'm an engineer. Can't wait. First, we're going to go through some PowerPoint stuff. So items. So, okay, list the competencies being assessed, because you want this chain to all make sense, right? So you look at what are the most important competencies, how are we going to assess that, how are we going to get the most signal and not noise, for this for this time period. Try to assess one thing at a time. This goes back to balance and removing candidate choice from mucking things up. So if you ask a candidate to solve this coding question, and we want it to be the most optimal code and really well written, and if you can do it as fast as possible, great, because we have more questions. And the candidate's like, well, I might have to make some trade-offs, but if I choose to be faster instead of well-written code, they don't know. One candidate makes that choice, another candidate makes another choice. How do you evaluate that? And especially if you have a secret rubric where actually them getting things done really fast, it was actually the most important thing, that would be even more of a problem, right? So you want to set your candidates up for success and try to assess one thing at a time, explicitly. Even if you're trying to assess ambiguity, which I have mixed feelings about, because on the job, you don't want your interview to over-index on like assertiveness, knowing this process, being able, an interview is a relationship between 2 people that will be experiencing it in different ways based on age, race, like who they're talking with. Whereas when you're on the job, you've got all this context. You're building relationships. So testing ambiguity, or how you can handle emergency situations on DevOps. Like I'd be really careful about how you set that up in an interview. But even if you want to test those sorts of things, be really explicit about it. I'm going to look at how you deal with an ambiguous question, ambiguous problem where you have to ask questions. So are you ready now? Ask me questions. You don't want to assess for mind reading. Okay, so assessing one thing at a time can really help when you're being explicit and reduce noise and keep your questions balanced. You're doing all this great work figuring out what your interview process should be, what your questions should be, what this format is, what your goals are, and make this guide for your interviewers. That will keep things objective, consistent. When interviewers do a poor job, it's like when you're, when an engineer messes up and accidentally deletes the database, and everyone's like, it's okay, we need to have a system that lets you succeed. It's the same thing with interviewing, right? Like if you're throwing your interviewers into an interview and they are like, I don't know what I'm doing, I have to bring my own question, and create guides to set interviewers up to be success so they can be consistent, so things are repeatable. Remove that cognitive overhead. there's a lot that has to go into doing a really nice interview. So anyway, that's that. These are just some ideas of what you can do in your guides. And now what I want to dig into, so here's my piece of advice around, I'm going to look at coding questions in particular, but there's other kinds of technical questions that this will apply to, like even if you have a design, like an open-ended creative design question, you actually want to try to make it more structured and use some of the techniques we're going to talk about with the coding questions. And that's something we're not going to talk more about in this workshop, but I'd love to talk about that afterwards if anyone's interested. Okay, use multi-part questions with shared context, but independent solutions. What am I talking about? I'm going to draw a picture. So, and this comes from the education space. Shared context, what I'm talking about here is that context, in this case, it's like things are, it's raining, and we want to, do some analysis on the rain. Or, shared context is what we explain about the problem space. Oh, we want to build a social network, so we're going to have, this list of people and their relationships, or we're building a system to, for autonomous driving vehicles, and like here's the data coming in. These are technical problems where the candidate is having to load this into their minds. We'd like you to build this, card game that works like this. And some contexts have cultural, meaning to them. I once was talking with someone who was like, yeah, an interviewer asked me to design War, and not only did I not know what that game was, which is it's a very common like U.S. childhood game, a card game. He's like, I didn't know what a U.S. card deck looked like, so I didn't know what the suits he was like, I was so confused. So you want to be careful about that. But context, it takes a candidate time to load, and when you're nervous, you're like many people when they get nervous, they stop taking in input as well. It's just like a physical response. Like an anxiety attack involves like your senses, like your vision shutting down and those sorts of things. Hopefully your candidates aren't like having anxiety attacks during an interview. But hey, it takes time. So if you're going to ask 5 questions and they all have different context, you're taking valuable time that maybe isn't important. So use shared context for your questions. But what you don't want to do, I actually don't have a slide on this, but you can imagine there are questions where sometimes interviewers want to ask one question and then they say, great, we're going to make it harder and we ask you a second question. And if there's multiple solutions to question 1, and some of those solutions will help question 2, and some of them you have to throw away and like restart all over for question 2. That's not balanced, because some random candidate choice, they didn't know, random candidate choice is not influencing the outcome. So what we suggest is use a shared context, but use totally different questions. That the solution for your first question doesn't have to do with your second question if you're going to ask multiple questions. I'm trying to. I was playing with for this workshop using metaphors. I don't know if this is going to work. So question 1 was like count the raindrops, and question 2 is like now we want to catch leaks, and it both has to do with water and raining. That's the context, but they're not like related. You don't have to count raindrops to catch leaks. Now there's 2 things I want to talk about just to go really really deep on this is that. One thing to think about is scaffolding. So maybe you're asking this question about counting raindrops. A candidate is getting confused. Normally, you'd want to give them hints because you don't want them stuck on something for 20 minutes. You're like, I'd rather use those 20 minutes to get more signal. Scaffolding is where you break down a question into smaller pieces for the candidate. Basically, it's taking a question that might have multiple parts, and you go ahead and just say, oh, it looks like you're having trouble looping over raindrops or identifying what a raindrop is. So you ask them a simpler question. So rather than giving them a hint, you ask a simpler question to see if you can expose their skills that way. Another thing that people will do is take a question, ask a question, catch leaks, and then make it harder. Like, okay, great, you did that. Well, what if multiple leaks happen at the same time? Tell me about that, which is a little bit like what I just said about related questions and can have that problem. But it might be useful to talk about design and sort of maybe have a conversation. So this is the problem space of coding questions. And I just want to step back and be like, why am I talking about multiple questions at all? Because this is the whole foundation for how we even think that we can assess coding ability. I'd never really thought about it before until this summer. But look, we're making a lot of assumptions here. A, we think there's some continuum of skill, maybe problem-solving skill or implementation or algorithms or different things, right? And what we're assuming is that when we ask a candidate to solve a coding question, if they know that thing, if they can do that really well, if they know how to debug, or if they know that level of problem, they're going to generally do it quickly, and they're going to generally get that class of question correct. Like they're going to be consistent. So we just have to ask them once, we see what they can do, and then we know. And then conversely, if they don't know something, like they're generally not going to know it, and it might happen right away, or they might struggle for a long time and actually want an interviewer to see what's happening and move things forward. But that's like a very this is a very interesting kind of assumption to make, right? Because there's a bar somewhere in here. Like there's an area where someone is like, well, I'm getting better at debugging, and like 80% of the time I'll figure out this problem in 30 minutes, but sometimes it'll take me longer. And like, what if the one time they're in your interview it takes longer, right? And for some, basically, if there's a bar somewhere where you're really, so if a candidate, if I just back up a second here, candidates, this is not the right line, but say you have a continuum. Candidates who are totally awesome on all your competencies are easy to hire because it's really obvious. And then people who aren't ready yet, that's really obvious too. And so that's great. And you don't want to, ideally, you're not spending a lot of time on both of those things, except for maybe selling to the really great people, right? People who are really, really ready for this. But when you have a bar somewhere, that's where you want to kind of optimize. And so if you have someone who is being inconsistent, maybe you do spend a little bit more time there. Or it's just an interesting space to consider, like what happens near your bar. So anyway, the point of this is to say we use multiple questions because what we're trying to do is zero in on where someone's competency is. And we do that by seeing what do they succeed at and what do they not succeed at. Whether this is a coding question, whether this is, even if you have open-ended design questions, try and break it down. Like what are the actual mini questions inside of my question? You know what I mean? And we have limited time. If the questions are too far apart, we get pretty imprecise. And so that's like if our hiring bar is somewhere in here, we're like, oh no. And obviously we can't ask them like a billion questions. So what do? Hey, I'm an engineer. My background's computer science. It sounds like a search problem, which we don't want to ask candidates search questions, right? Like search has been already implemented for us. But it is a search space, right? Like we want to ask a question, see how they do, and try and like narrow in that way, right? I don't know if this was like too much computer science humor. I got really excited when I saw this, But it's like, so you get it, right? Like there's a really long continuum. You have candidates coming in, they're all over the place. What if you can explore this space and adapt it to where the candidate is and make the best use of your time? So, and so that's why I talked about, when do you use, is this going to be a scaffolding question? Is this just an easier question? Do you ask the same level question? How do you challenge someone? How do you move through this space to widen that window of who you can assess and how you can level people? Because it actually turns out that a lot of our bigger clients at Karat, they have so many roles that actually the difficult thing isn't really just hiring someone, it's leveling them. And so that's why it really is a continuum, not like a binary decision, because maybe you have multiple options, right? You're trying to hire the person, not hire to a specific role. Wow, let's see on time. We're doing great. So the last thing I'm going to say about this is how do you analyze your questions? Like we're going to actually dig into data, which you may or may not have like 300 interviews every quarter to look at. If you do, that's really cool. In the hundreds is when you can start to really understand your questions. From a data point of view. You can always use best practices. Okay, so let's suppose that you had 100 candidates. You had an interview question that was like more like an exam. I'm not saying this is how you should run your hiring process, but suppose you had like an interview that resulted in assessments from 1 to 100, like just like an exam, right? These scores. And you had candidates, and you knew somehow magically exactly what they should score from 1 to 100, laid out on this line. And then you did this interview with them or asked them this question and saw what they did, and if your assessment process is perfect, you would get a straight line because the person who should get a 20 gets a 20. Okay. So, what you don't want to see is this kind of curve, right? And the specific problem with this curve is that two candidates who have different skill levels, this candidate is quite a bit more advanced, than this person, is getting a very similar score. Right? And then the problem, and especially if this is where your bar is, these two candidates who are fairly similar, right? On your assessment, it looks like they're in different places. So you've kind of we've clustered candidates who are maybe in different places together, and we've made this one area very small. We've pushed candidates are getting pushed away. And if our bar happens to be right here, and especially because, hey, maybe near our bar, we want to be spending time. We want to know who's near this bar because maybe we want to make sure we want to do extra quality control. Maybe we want to offer a redo. Because it turns out that sometimes people do better the second time. Which, if that's always happening, I would say, well, how can we fix the first time? Everyone shouldn't have to interview twice. But on the other hand, things happen, and sometimes people just perform better the second time, and they're not cheating. They're different questions. If you have a redo with different questions, different interviewer, that's what we do at Karat. And so we've sort of studied this, and if people are doing better, it's not a cheat. You've just literally seen them perform better, and that's usually they go on to be just as successful on sites and then getting hired. Okay, so how this looks, because we don't usually have an Oracle, so how this usually looks is what you can do to analyze your data is have your x-axis be a score. Now that might just be buckets, often there's there's very no, yes, double yes, or whatever that means to you. Fast track requires review, not ready. So you have your score, and you're gonna look at how many candidates are getting that result in your process, and so, by the way, this surprised me when I realized this was more flat. I was expecting it actually to look like this, to be really. So this is saying for candidates who are really not a fit, they can't program or something. I was expecting it to be low because I was like, isn't our sourcing kind of figuring that out? And to some extent on a, maybe this changes if we're talking about later in an on-site versus an initial, early, a screen or something. But the point is this, that you're trying to filter out a lot of people. So this being high means you're doing a lot of filtering. But then wherever your bar is, you want this to come down because you want to be really sensitive. In that other graph where it was this nice linear line with no inflection points, you want to have a lot of sensitivity near your bar and also for that long tail of really qualified candidates to really understand that. So I know I'm spending a lot of time on this. It gets me really excited because I think this is interesting domain. At Karat, we actually do all of this analysis, and we figure out when it's time, when is a question ready, when should you retire it, what is causing these inflection points. And so I think it's time for y'all to share, if you feel comfortable, and let's maybe, I know some people don't want to share their exact questions, but what's going on with how you develop questions or analyze them? What kinds of things, what kinds of things can you improve? Yeah? We're gonna take a few minutes to talk about this. If you have any questions, please come up and ask me. I feel like I went over a lot of things. I love it. Hey guys, I'm gonna interrupt you all again. Thanks for giving me your attention after I interrupt y'all. I would love to know what are some of the things that came up. And I have some seeds already. Some plants in the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
I heard something really, hello. I heard something really beautiful from Doris over here. She's been in the game for 30 years, so she's a lot of wisdom. And she was kind of speaking to the fact that a lot of recruiters are afraid of maybe failing at their job, failing of making the wrong choice. If they're junior, they're really new. And she was speaking to the fact that some of them will be like, oh, wow, let's hire someone who's like me, or let's hire someone who's like Joe, our high performer. When in fact, she's like, well, why? She likes to turn back and say, well, why do we need to hire another Joe? Or he's a high performer and that's great, but what is Joe not doing? And how can we hire for what's not being done here?
Yeah, team building.
Totally.
Yes.
And so just kind of this idea that we want the cookie cutter, perfect check-off list person actually hurts the company in the long run. I thought that was really beautiful.
I want to spend some time on that. What's your name? Alex, do you want to share what you suggested? Your graph. I love graphs. Come on. Here.
Yeah, I don't really know how to do that.
I can share it for you, but I like your voice.
Okay. Can you hold this up? So I guess what I was saying is that if you kind of draw out all your competencies, so if each one of these lines is a competency and then you actually have your team that's up here. So let's say this is Joe, you're really senior person, and then you have Mel, who's also senior. So Joe's a 5 here, Mel's a 4 here. Joe's got a 5 in this area. Mel's got like a 3 in this area, and then you have like, he's a 4 here, she's a 2 here. Then as you're like doing your hire, you can actually look to see like, yes, this person's like a 2, but Joe and Mel are actually really strong in that. So we can actually afford to like bring in the candidate who doesn't have as much experience in here. And if you have like this person's a 3, like you've still got Joe who's really strong in this area. And then for this area, you'd want to have someone who is like a 3 to a 5 to make sure that you're kind of like balancing out like all the competencies on the team.
Yes, love it. Thank you. So, and here's what maybe it doesn't look exactly like that. Yeah, let's clap. That was nice. That was nice. I like to Tom Sawyer these sorts of things. Okay, look, we got to be sensitive to people. People don't always want to, like, if I was working somewhere and my manager was like, we need you to go through our interview process. I'm like, oh no, what if they find out I wasn't really good enough? You know, like that might be scary. But the idea is kind of remains, especially, you know, as you know, managers are secretly always judging. It's because it's part of the job. Honestly, this is really good advice for interviewers too, right? Be outwardly curious and encouraging and supportive, but like inside you're skeptical. And you're like, I'm not going to judge this book by cover. I'm going to ask that follow-up question, right? But don't be outwardly skeptical. No one likes that. Okay, but the point remains that you want to think about, here's the thing, one of the takeaways. Hiring bars tend to creep up. And actually, I'm probably not going to have time, and I'm going to like skip ahead to the end of this when we look at like what it really means to be predictive and like where the candidates you're not hiring going. And often what we see is that the hiring bar is too high, that people are missing out on opportunities. And so what we're kind of looking at is how can we address that creep? And so one of the ways is to honestly look at, well, what is working on our team? And would our current engineers who are successful and we love them and everything's going great, like make it through? And I love that idea of what are ways that we can, especially if the norm, you know, if the team isn't wide and if there are things that are missing, like how do you figure that out? Like how do you know what you don't know? How do you see what's not in the room? How do we see what could be helping? Anything we can do to brainstorm on that? Karina, I would love to hear from, because we talked a little bit about your hiring process at Nova Credit.
Sure. So for the engineering specifically, I think like our skills assessment portion, what we do is we actually give them the option of either doing 2 one-hour tech screens or a take-home assignment. And so a lot of this is because, again, like people perform differently in different areas, and some people don't like to be, you know, like kind of hovered over. But the thing that I really question is for the take-home assignment, we internally have a rubric for how we grade and how we determine who moves to the next kind of portion of the interview. But I think during this and reflecting, I had asked, you know, whether it would be a smart idea to share that rubric with the candidate as well, so they know, you know, these are the areas where they're being evaluated, and this, I think it also helps. It's easier to provide feedback if they ask for it later, whether if they didn't make it as far in the process.
Yes, share that rubric. Maybe it's not the exact rubric, but it's share what you're looking for, whether it's a live interview, whether it's a take-home. So take-home tests have not the most, but they have a lot of creep. I would maybe, like, this is not data back, but I'd be like, maybe they have the most creep. Because what happens is the people reviewing them are seeing the best ones. And suddenly you're like, that's what I want to see. Like, why can't that candidate do this amazing job? And even though, you know, the instructions were spend 3 hours on this, like that candidate spent 20. Because quite frankly, if I was having to give advice to a candidate, I'd say, please spend 10 times as much time on this and impress the socks off of your interviewer because you don't know the rubric. And so having a rubric, even just having a rubric, will let all the interviewers know, or all the reviewers or whoever, we'll let them know. It'll establish a consistent hiring bar. It tells you what's important, right? It prevents creep. Hey, it's okay to raise your hiring bar. That's great if that's, you know, what you need to do, but make sure it's intentional, right? So and then sharing that with the candidate gets back to candidates need to know how, you know, the candidate is trying to like work with the candidate, assess one thing at a time, tell the candidate what that is. Cool. So yes.
I was just going to say to kind of even drive that point further,
Yeah.
When you're at a company, the performance review process, your employees are aware of the rubric. They understand what it is, and that's perfectly fine, right? So why is it so unacceptable during the interview process?
I love it. That's really great. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We have 10 minutes, and there's something that I think is really, well, here's what I want to say. I just want to address something else that Doris brought up, just this idea of there's different strengths on a team. And sorry, I don't know your name who actually asked the question as well. But another thing is that I am just gonna skip ahead real quick because want to get this right. We'll come back. It's okay. And I'll share these slides. We can get through. Okay, here's the one. Is your hiring bar too high? There's like so little data I could really share, around here, and I didn't really put stuff together. But this was like true story. We looked at all these candidates who we had at Karat. We had assessed them, and we feel pretty good about the consistency and equity of the interviews that we do. And we'd sort of assess, these are candidates that were like fast track, like let's move them forward to an on-site. Here we're like invite these to the next round. Like these are solid candidates, and they were often declined at the on-site, declined at a phone screen, like not even considered. And they all went on to well-known companies: Zillow, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Cloudera. And so we were in this particular case seeing that maybe the hiring bar was too high, and this was causing people to miss their hiring goals, which then slows down the product, and it's all of those things, right? One of the things when establishing a clear hiring bar, there's two situations here. One is that, okay, here's what I first want to say. There's many different strengths that people are going to bring, and so you need an interview process. It's kind of like, I don't know if a sieve is the right metaphor, but you need to have a varied interview process. I'm not going to say, like some people are like, oh, whiteboard interviews are awful and you should only do this other thing. And the point is, like, people are different, and you are getting some information and signal from different things. So have all the different things, and see where people's strengths are, and don't look for all yeses on all the strengths, because you don't need that. And in particular, what we were sometimes finding, if places that have a hiring bar that's too high, they're doing all of the same kind of interview. Maybe they have 4 like puzzle coding interviews in a row. And the problem is that if a candidate does really well on 3, but does poorly on 1 of those, they're like, well, they're not good. And the point is actually, when you're looking at strengths, sometimes people mess up and they're not good, but they have that strength, right? So if you're seeing, if you're seeing someone choke on like 1 out of 4 of the same interview type, like they're actually good. And first of all, you shouldn't have been doing 4 of them. Like you want to make sure the one that you do isn't the choke, but do a behavioral, to look at the communicating with stakeholders, all of those things, right? So, and when we can see that in a debrief session, sometimes everyone's yes, but like one person's a no. Like you don't necessarily want to optimize for everyone being a yes, and I know that's tricky. And as a hiring manager, if you're running debrief sessions or really making decisions, I strongly recommend Sam Kainer's guide to participatory decision making, like how you can bring a team through a process where they might not always agree, because you don't want to hire someone that someone's like, I will not work with that person. So I'm just saying it's tricky. It's tricky if someone's saying like, I don't think this person's qualified. But don't optimize for the all yeses. Be really intentional about that. There's twice where I've hired someone where there are people on my team that said no, and they were very. I thought that they made a bad assessment. There's some other things going on, and I don't regret those at all. They turned out within the first week. One of those people was people were coming. Their teammate was coming to me saying, "Wow, she's so amazing. This was actually the first woman hire also. So, but she blew people away with how good she was and how communicative. And during the interview, the interviewers said no, because they were like, well, we asked her if she would like to write on the whiteboard, and she said she wouldn't. So then she never wrote any code on the whiteboard, so we don't want to hire her. And I was like, I don't know, like, what happened? Like, that was, not to blame the interviewer. They didn't receive any training, and interviewer communication can actually be really difficult. It's a skill in itself. But I do want to call out that sometimes there are flags, right? Like if there are some things that if it happens once, you want to take that seriously. It's hard to weigh, technical talent, communication skills. Like there's some things where you're not just trying to say it's okay. It's okay if they're good at this and not good at that. There might be a minimum for all of your competencies, basically, right? So if someone's falling below any one of those things, it won't lead, they won't be successful. Communication, communication flags, attitude flags, some of those might be the things that, you just see them once and you're like, okay. Okay, so establish a clear hiring bar. Let's see. I kind of want to just open it up for questions because we have 5 minutes left. I want to thank everyone for coming. This has been super fun. I really appreciated all the comments and everything. And so I don't know if there's any lingering questions. I know I basically prepared material that I didn't go through, which is super annoying. I'll share this. I will put the slides on my Twitter. I don't know if I put my Stay Calm comic might be on this sheet or maybe not. That's my Twitter, or you can email me at luce@karat.io. Let me see if oh, there we go. I will put it on LinkedIn. I will make sure to put a message for these slides. And we do sometimes, I give workshops at other conferences and meetups on these more specific topics. I would always love to see you guys there. We do webinars sometimes. So thanks. Yes?
I think just a comment just with the last thing that you mentioned. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it's a silly little thing, but we went to the Talent 42 conference, and they had shared information about different things people talk about, especially with whiteboarding. A lot of female candidates have mentioned they don't like whiteboarding specifically because they feel uncomfortable writing in front of a group of men who are just like staring at their ass. And so it's something little like that maybe, you know, she felt uncomfortable, and it's a good thing that you didn't like hold her accountable for that, you know what I mean? Because it's a little thing where she felt uncomfortable maybe.
Yeah. I mean, and the other signal is that she had other interviews that did well. She did a ton of open source contributions.
Sure.
So, you know, it wasn't like you take risks, and it's okay to take risks, but you try to be intentional, yeah.
So I have a question, like, how would you balance, let's say, culture fit versus skills? Let's say the person you're interviewing is amazing in skills, but doesn't look exactly like the rest of the people in your company. And like how the interviewers themselves might view him and might judge, like have been biased, let's say.
Yeah. Okay, I think there's two sides to this. One is that, you know, that you want to have a minimum technical competency to be productive within some amount of time when you hire someone, right? But typically, engineering, like being an engineer, everything you come to work to do every day is set up to make you a better engineer, and you're going to grow. If you're not a great communicator, if you have like, if there's cultural, like collaboration problems, you know, hey, we're all human, and you know, we're all on those journeys. But like, work is often not a great place to get better at those things. So that's why I generally think about communication and collaboration skills. Not that, you know, hey, we can develop all, you know, we can develop those in workplaces. You know, professional skills are something we'll learn over time. But there's something, there's some things that like a workplace actually isn't set up to teach you compared to like technical things. It's actually, you know, a lot of performance management issues aren't technical, basically. The other side of this is like basically more on like interviewer training. And that's something I would just say, go have a look at these slides, and I'll actually post some other slides that go into more depth around. There's two things. One is interview conduct and communication, which I think can be really helpful in preventing bias. Also having structured write-ups, where you're, you know, basically you want your interviewers to know what is noise and what is signal. So is it signal or is it noise when someone, you know, obviously if someone has an accent, that's probably noise. You know, I might have to ask them to repeat themselves a little bit, you know, during the interview, and you don't want that time. Like if I only have an hour and or 45 minutes, and someone might need extra time, whether it's, you know, English as a second language or dyslexia sometimes comes up for us, and you know, there's other things where the interview doesn't have to be an hour, right? Sometimes you just want to give it more time because you're just trying to assess some signal. I mean, you want things to be consistent. It's complicated, but like when you're working with someone, obviously, like a lot of the issue, you don't want issues in an interview. That's noise if it's not an issue on the job, right? So you're trying to figure that out, and so you just want to have a really explicit rubric so they know, like, you know, you want to suss out how well did someone explain something. You know, that's separate. That's like a separate skill than maybe how they explained it, basically. So have a rubric that actually separates like what observation, like how do you know, like what is the observation? Like help the interviewers out explicitly, right? And the other thing is basically being really clear with, so everything someone says or does during an interview as an interviewer, it's going to be one of these three things. You're going to be clarifying what the candidate should do. You're going to be giving encouragement and support, or you're going to be you know, giving them hints. That's a big part of technical interviews. And I call this out because I once was talking with someone about this at a workshop. This was actually last year, and someone said, I'd never thought about how encouragement is different than hints. And that's important because hints can often tank the assessment, or if they impact the assessment. But giving encouragement is actually helping a candidate perform their best, you know, whatever that means for them, you know, engaging with them, being an active listener. And so if you're not doing encouragement, that can be really problematic. And also being really clear about, I hate the trope of ambiguous interviews. There's so much noise that can happen just in how candidates misunderstand. If a candidate misunderstands the question, it's not a hint to just clarify the question, right? That shouldn't be a penalty. It's hard to process information. Make sure the candidate, you don't want your candidate to spend 20 minutes solving the wrong question. That's not that they're not a good fit for the job. They just wasted, you just both wasted your time, right? So, there's more detailed best practices of trying to figure out what that exactly means. But we'll leave that for later. Yeah.
An interview should never, ever, ever, ever be an interrogation. If you're interrogating your candidates, rapid fire, answer this question, next question, and there's no eye contact, there's no conversation, there's no context of why you're even asking the question.
Yeah.
Okay, the context is huge when it comes to how you're going to respond. So for example, if you, in a technical interview, says here's one of our big problems that we're trying to solve right now. We're trying to do A, B, C, and D. And your question is, given your experience, have you done tried to solve a similar problem? So tell me about it. That's context. And it's also giving them a chance to tell a story about how they problem solved. It may not be a specific coding question, right? Write out the algorithm. But if you're not giving them an opportunity to give context to their answer either, then you're not going to get the full story and really be able to assess their capability.
Yeah, I see your hand. And just to follow up on this, it's also very common for interviewers, especially when they're new, they're going to be nervous. And I've sort of sat in and watched some of these and realized that people didn't even realize as an interviewer they were very closed and stood in the corner, and they were so uncomfortable because they were new to this, and that totally impacts the candidate. So even just be explicit for everyone so everyone can succeed, and talk about all of there's a lot of body language and other talking about microaggressions. When should you be silent? When are you interrupting someone, and when are you being interactive? When does someone need a hint? Or when are they just, when are they capable but not confident? I mean, some people just like to sort of pair in an interview. It doesn't mean they need you to tell them the answer. Different things like that. I'll go to you, and then I think we're over time. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.